Well, I've discussed with you before what my favorite animal is. Can you remember? Some people think it's a dog because I've said some negative things about cats. Oh, they were interpreted as negative. It's not actually dogs. I love dogs dearly, and I like cats too. But I really, really like donkeys. What are you laughing at? Do you like donkeys? You're not sure? Well, you might like this. You might like this story. You might like this, kind of. I remember you made. Your cousin lives on a farm. Do they have donkeys? No. I remember you made really good donkey noises last time, Isabel. So I might need your help with this story. Well, this story actually comes from the Muslim tradition, and it's about this kind of trickster who's very famous throughout the kind of Middle East and Persia, called Nasruddin. And, you know, Nasruddin knows, he's got this neighbor that he doesn't really get on with. He doesn't really like him. And his neighbor comes over and says, Nasruddin, can I borrow your donkey to go to the markets to pick up my fruits and vegetables and supplies for the week? And Nasruddin doesn't want to really give him the donkey. But he says, oh, no, I can't, I'm sorry. My brother came over to get the donkey. And my brother took it away, and he's away at the market with it. And his neighbor went, oh, that's a shame. Well, maybe I'll come back tomorrow. So the neighbor's leaving. And right when the neighbor's leaving, the donkey's in the backyard. And he makes a huge noise. Ee-ah! And the neighbor goes, I thought you said your donkey was with your brother. And the student's a little bit puzzled. And he goes, well, who are you going to believe, me or the donkey? The neighbor says, I believe the donkey. And he goes, oh, okay. Well, I don't really trust you with my donkey, so if you're going to go to the market, I'm going to come with you to the market and make sure you look after my donkey, because I really love my donkey. My donkey's one of my best friends. So Nasruddin, his neighbor, and the donkey all go off to market. But it's a really, really hot day. Really hot day. And so they stop for a rest, and they're having some lunch on the way to the market because it's a long journey. And the neighbor kind of sits down in the shadow of the donkey. And Nasruddin goes, you can't. You paid for the donkey, not in shadow. And the neighbor went, that's ridiculous. When I paid the donkey, I get to be in the shadow. Nasruddin said, no, you need to move. The shadow's mine. You only paid for the donkey. And so they get into this terrible argument about the shadow and who owns the shadow of the donkey, who owns the donkey. And the donkey kind of gets fed up with all this argument. So guess what the donkey does? It walks away. Yeah, just walks away, leaves them. And they keep arguing. Even though the shadow's gone, the donkey's gone, they keep arguing. And then all of a sudden they realized they were so busy arguing, they couldn't even remember what they were arguing about. And the donkey is gone. Sometimes we do that when we get so angry. We get so focused and angry and trying to convert someone else to our opinion. We forget what we're thinking about. Does that happen to you? It happens to me daily. I get arguing, and then this, we've got a big political election going on, and there's a lot of arguing and disagreement, and it's a really hard time. So when you find yourself arguing with someone, just do a check and like, is this really important? No. And so just think, sometimes it's not worth arguing, and sometimes you need to remember what's really important. So thank you so much for listening. It's time for your religious education class now. Enjoy yourself, and thank you for the donkey noises, Isabel.
When preparing a reflection for a service, I often go to one of my favorite books, Consolations, by poet David White. Consolation contains 52 reflections on words like joy, despair, heartbreak, and rest. It's my favorite book to turn to when I'm troubled or unwound and need solace or hope. As I prepared for today's service, I went to Consolations. The word that called to me is denial. Yes, I'm in denial. As I've shared before, I don't pay attention to the news very much, although Kamala Harris entering the election has made me peek a bit here and there. David White's essay on denial begins, "Denial is deeply underestimated as a state of being. Denial is an ever-present and even splendid thing when seen in the light of its merciful and elemental powers to cradle and hold an identity until it is ready to move on. Faced with the depth of loss and disappearance in the average life, a measure of denial is creative, necessary, and self-compassionate." Nice, right? My denial cradles me until I am ready to move on. I also like to think about my denial in this case being compassionate, like self-care. The election has been looming for months, and I've done what I can to support the outcomes I think are best for our country moving forward. My denial has helped me have peace and not worry about something I cannot control after I've taken the actions I've been able to. David White continues with, "Denial fully experienced also enables us to understand the full measure of our reluctance to be here, thus becoming a pathway to self-knowledge, a way of both paying attention to and appreciating what is asking to be seen. Denial is a beautiful transitional state every human being inhibits before they are emancipated into the next larger context and orphaned, often against their will, for their very old and familiar home." This is such an interesting concept to me. Denial can be a path to self-knowledge. What does this denial I have about the election teach me about myself? I was thinking about this, and first, I've learned to not worry about things that haven't happened yet or that I don't have control over. This is actually a strength of mine. It keeps me sane in my very busy work life, and it was something that I learned and had to do between Dave's scans when he had pancreatic cancer to help me be sane. My denial also reminds me that I'm an optimist until I can no longer be. For today and until this election is settled, I am choosing to think optimistically about the outcome. In reflecting on this topic, I also know that I'm a pragmatic realist. If the worst outcomes happen and chaos ensues, I know that my loved ones and I will deal with it to the best of our ability, hopefully with compassion and grace, which is all we can ask for. I cannot ask anything else of myself. And here again, my optimism in people shines. I believe there is good in all of us, and that there will be many of us who will work together to make the best of whatever happens. David White concludes his essay on denial with, "To live in denial is to be in very good company. Denial is the crossroads between the perception and the readiness. To deny denial is to invite powers into our lives we have not yet readied ourselves to meet." Am I ready to meet the outcome of this week's election in our country? Either outcome may have significant ramifications. Perhaps this time of denial is getting me ready for whatever comes. I believe in the resilience of humanity. I believe we all want our children and grandchildren to be safe. While ideas and concepts of how our country should be run, there are broad differences between the citizens of our beautiful country. But I believe we are all essentially love and that the world can be transformed by love. Yes, I am afraid. And I believe in you and me and our community, our state, even those who vote differently than I do. This strengthens my spirits and gives me hope. It's part of my resilience. There are many ways each of us has dealt with the stresses and knowns of this upcoming election, some with worry, some with action, some with the study of history. I'm sure we could generate a list of at least 10 more ways people in your life have approached this huge unknown. We've all been getting ready in our own way, and I am confident as a community and as humankind, we will each have a role in what comes next. For me, I choose to believe that it will all be okay at some point. Perhaps my denial has given me the energy that will be required to be a part of what makes things right. Take care of yourself, my friends. Be kind to yourself and to others. Maybe take a rest if you've been working hard and stressed. And know that this beloved community will be there for all of us.
Well, we are only 3 days away from the beginning of the 2028 presidential election. Is it too soon for that one? Perhaps. Let's get this one over first. Okay, I hear you. I can't help feeling, look at this election. Some of you may remember the old movie, I think it was from 1972. That's old, sorry. But Robert Redford, the candidate, do any of you remember that, where he's playing a senator for California? He starts off very idealistic and wants to really do good and be a public servant. Do you remember the end of the movie? And sorry, you've had 50 years to see it. I'm going to give a spoiler here. He wins the election. And he's talking to his campaign manager and go, what do we do next? What do we do next? He's lost all sense of who he is. A little bit like the two people arguing about the donkey shadow earlier. They got so busy into the argument, they kind of lost their essence of what they're about, what they're doing. And it's amazing if you watch that movie now, how relevant a lot of the themes are 52 years later. I don't know whether to be hopeful or disappointed with that. What next? Don't get me wrong, I care about this result. As a minister, I'm not allowed to endorse a candidate from the pulpit. But I vote my values. And you know what my values are. I talk about them every Sunday. I talk about them every meeting. If you don't know my values, you just haven't been paying attention. I don't blame you. There's other things to worry about. But there's big fears with this election. There's immense suffering that can happen as a result of it. Many of us feel democracy is at risk. We worry about the future of our planet. We worry about reduced freedoms, reproductive choice, transgender equality. And we worry about empowering toxic masculinity. Today's service, we're focusing on how do we repair our resilience and how do we repair our hope. If our resiliency was a gas tank, I think many of us would be running in fumes. After the 2020 pandemic, the Ukraine war, the situation in Gaza, the tragedy in Gaza, Lebanon, environmental crisis, political turmoil, we are emotionally exhausted. Our patience and energy are razor thin. And resilience is our emotional strength to cope and overcome negative events and barriers in our life. But resilience is not a trait, it's a process. It's not a trait we have, it's a process we can achieve. How do we move forward in hope and health amidst adversity, trauma, and stress? What is your capacity for resilience right now? What is your capacity for resilience Tuesday night, Wednesday? There's 4 main ways to build a resistance, to repair a resilience. Tracey talked quite beautifully about self-care. Self-care is important. Denial is one way of dealing with it. I also invite you to find stories of hope and inspiration. Because resilience is often tied to hope. To have resilience without hope is really, really difficult. So what are you hoping for? What are you hoping for regardless of the result on Tuesday or whenever we find out the result? Another idea of resilience is when you're faced with struggles, when you're faced with trauma, when we're faced with adversity, is can we have a growth mindset from that? Can we look at it as an opportunity for growth and not just as some tragedy that we just have to live with and live through? Because resilience, we often think of as that ability to return to a previous shape after being bent, compressed, or stressed. Sometimes we can't get back to where we were. We can only be transformed by the situation. And I think sometimes the biggest struggle with resilience is we're trying to get back to some idealized state we were in before that we cannot get back to. We have to be transformed and move forward with whatever struggles, whatever trauma, whatever adversity we're facing. Our choice for growth is to let go of trying to return to some previous state and accept the possibility of transformation. One thing I've strongly encouraged many of us to do is not put a political identity at the center of who we are, but to put a spiritual identity at the center of who we are. Politics is about win-loss. A spiritual identity is about hope and transformation and resilience. What are your sources of inspiration and hope? God, self, community, human nature, history, spirituality, our conscience. What are your sources of hope, resilience, and transformation? The late Czech president, playwright, democracy activist, and a former political prisoner under the communist regime in Czech Republic, Václav Havel, says this. He says, "The kind of hope I often think about, especially in situations that are particularly hopeless, such as prison, I understand above all as a state of mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It's a dimension of the soul. It's not essentially dependent on some observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not a prediction of the future. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons." Hope in this deep, powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance of success. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. Those are the words of Václav Havel. He was often a political prisoner, so he knows about hope and hopelessness. Hope is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. And he says it's not the same thing as optimism. And I always liked my friend's description of his daughter, who he described as the most optimistic person he'd ever met. He said to me that if she woke up in Christmas morning and her bedroom was full of manure, she would think he was getting a pony for Christmas. I forgot to say how the word pony. Another source I look for hope is my ancestors, my family. My paternal grandfather was in the trenches of the First World War. He suffered mustard gas in 1915. He lived into the 1930s. My dad was born in the 1930s. But this was the Bible he had with him in the trenches of the First World War. I never met him. He died before I was born. But I think about this and the horror they saw in the trenches of the First World War. And if you go to museums in Britain or Europe, you see the exact same Bibles in German, in French, in Italian, in Dutch. Exact same Bible, just different language. And there's a note at the front, from Mother to J. Moore Ferguson, January 13th, 1915. I'll leave that here if any of you want to come up afterwards and see it. But I think of what that man must have gone through, like so many thousands and millions of men have went through, mainly men in the First World War, of course. And yet, he was able to survive long enough with the blistered lungs of mustard gas. For my father, without his resilience, I would not be here. And my other grandfather was a coal miner down the mines at 14. Died of black lung, 1961, the year before I was born. Working down the mines, lost an eye in a mining accident and continued working. The resilience of those people, that gives me hope. However much is happening in the election on Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever it's decided, that's nothing compared to what those people in my family suffered. And I suspect every one of us here, our ancestors went through some struggle, whether it was the Depression of the 1930s here, whether it was the Second World War, Vietnam War, Korean War. They went through these real struggles. It's not for us to give up. It's for us to be inspired to do what we can, to live through whatever struggles we're going through. That's what it means to put a spiritual identity at the center of who we are, and not a political identity. However important politics are, there's more important things. Because resilient people identify as survivors and not victims, flexible and adaptive. And as Tracey beautifully said, focus on the aspects we can control. Psychologists have identified factors that make a person more resilient, such as a positive attitude, hopeful as opposed to optimistic, the ability to regulate our emotions in response to hardships, ability to change course while moving towards goals and approach the possibility of failure with a growth mindset. The great Australian singer Nick Cave says, hope is optimism with a broken heart. Hope is optimism with a broken heart. He lost 2 of his children, one at 31 for cancer, one 15 in a climbing accident. And Tracey also mentioned some of us can be inspired, and I include myself in this, of looking at history. And Howard Zinn, the great, I would call radical historian, hugely influential in me, wrote the Indigenous People's History of the United States, the People's History of the United States, and many others. In 2007, he said, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of competition and cruelty, but also compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we only see the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending the spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presence. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is in itself a marvelous victory." Those are the words of the late historian Howard Zinn. And I want to share you a story that continually inspires me. It's people who live in one of the most difficult areas of the world, the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. They had the biggest tragedy I think you can imagine. This is the stories from 20 years ago. The 12-year-old son, Ahmed, was killed by the Israeli army, shot, because he was playing with a toy gun that by all accounts looked like a real one. His parents, Ishmael and Abla Khadib, were devastated. But they did not call for revenge. The Israeli army acknowledged the mistake. No calls for revenge were acted out. But it's the next thing that the parents did. The son had been taken to an Israeli hospital, and they were willing to donate his heart, kidneys, liver, and lungs, and they were transplanted to 6 Israelis. People who were often thought of as the enemy in the Jenin refugee camp. But what Ishmael Khadib, the father, said is quite powerful. He said, "The hope is the Israeli people will learn the lesson from what we have done. Those 6 people will learn the lessons that we Palestinians are human beings too." They were praised for their action, yet the Khadibs, both the mother and father, said, while peace and a desire to alleviate suffering of others was important to them, their action was also an act of resistance, an anger at a wrong they perceived. If only more of us could express our anger and sadness in such a positive way. That is a hopeful, profound, and life-affirming act. To give life to people who took away your 12-year-old son, who are often seen as enemies around you. These people live in one of the most desperate circumstances in the world. They lost their son, and they were still able to see this act of giving, this act of hope, this act that was life-affirming to others. I have no excuse not to do so myself. faith. And this was a couple of faith. Can help grow and hope in all of us as the basis of resilience. So I invite you to think of those stories that you know from your family, from around the world, from this neighborhood, from your own actions that inspire you with hope. And can you connect that to your imagination of the future that you want to have, regardless of the political results? Because whatever happens, if who we want to win or who we don't want to win wins, there's work for us all to do. There's work that we all need to do. And can we have a vision of the future that we can live into? Can we orient our soul, our spirit, and our heart to live into a life-affirming, life-enhancing, life-saving world? Because the world, regardless, needs to be healed, and we need to be the ones to do it. What we choose to emphasize in our worldview will determine our lives and the lives of those around us. And hope is ultimately, what vision of the possible do we want to live into in the present?